All right, I want to welcome everybody to what Game of Thrones teaches about cybersecurity. So first off, a little bit about myself. My name is Ryan Cassetto. I'm a product marketing manager at Exabeam. I've got about 10 years of experience in cybersecurity. Prior to working at Exabeam, I've held various other product marketing roles at security companies, including Imperva, Encapsula, Distill Networks, and Armorized Technologies, which is now part of Proofpoint. On the Game of Thrones side, I have a different set of credentials. So first off, I once occupied the Iron Throne for what that's worth. Secondly, I own a dog that looks very much like a dire wolf. And then thirdly, I've authored a couple of articles on dark reading about this subject, so what Game of Thrones can teach you about cybersecurity. So if you like this specific webinar and you want to look for some more in-depth content, feel free to check those articles out on dark reading. Okay, so my next point is that I'm totally caught up with Game of Thrones, and so is this presentation. So this is my official spoiler alert. If you are not caught up and that's a problem, this is probably not a good presentation for you. With that said, what we'll be talking about today, first off, we'll do a session primer. The goal here is really to give you the bits of information that you need to really appreciate the rest of the conversation. After that, we'll talk about the threat landscape. We'll talk about insider threats, both from a compromised insider point of view and a malicious insider point of view. We'll also talk about some common security approaches, and then we will talk about how to prepare for security breaches during a security shortage, which we're currently experiencing in the real world. So let's kick things off. We'll start with some ominous warnings. Now, if you grew up in Westeros, you probably know that winter is coming. For the rest of us, you may not even know what that means. So why don't we start with that? What does winter is coming even mean? Well, it actually harkens back to the Long Night, which was an event that happened thousands of years ago. Long story short, long nights are bad news. It was a winter that lasted a generation. There was tons of snow because the snow wasn't melting, and that ended up burying all of the fields with dozens of feet of snow, so there was no food. And then we get our supervillain, which is the Night King. His underlings, if you will, come in two types. There's the White Walkers, which are basically mid-level managers of his evil empire. And then you've got the undead. We'll talk a little bit more about that. His undead are called waits. Okay, so if you live in a less fanciful world, if you live in the real world, in a modern version of that, you've probably heard of a very similar threat. That being these guys, the hackers. Now, before you scoff, let me bring up a couple of points. First off, all of these companies, you probably know the vast majority of them, and one of the things that they have in common is that they have all fallen victim to hackers and had a very large, very public data breach. Now, not only is that bad news for the people who leverage these, the consumers and the customers of these companies, the companies also suffered some ill effects. Things like brand damage, loss of compliance, having to pay out fees, insurance. Just Home Depot and Target alone probably had to spend around $143 million in insurance fees just to handle their incidents. So this is a big, big deal. Now, to talk a little bit about the adversaries here, they are the White Walkers. I thought that the best way to discuss them and their capabilities would be to do it through the frame of reference of monsters that you may already know, and I felt like zombies and vampires were the natural picks. Let me tell you why. On the zombie side, you've got these undead creatures. They're dumb, and what happens is they infect their victims by biting them, and then those victims turn into zombies, and it creates this horde. So you have like this undead, dumb army that's amassing everything. Now, on the vampire side, they're also undead, but some areas that they're different is they are intelligent. They also infect their victims, also by biting. However, vampires create a hierarchy. It's kind of like a multi-tier marketing scheme, where if you kill a vampire up the chain, you kill some vampires below them at the same time. Now, the Night King, who is the head of the White Walker army, has some of the characteristics of both. So he's immortal, not necessarily undead, but definitely immortal. He's very intelligent. He has the ability to infect victims and to raise the dead, and he is creating a hierarchy. Just so we can understand some of my comments later in the presentation, a quick note on his hierarchy. So he's the evil mastermind. He's basically built a criminal organization that has these mid-level managers. They're the White Walkers. Now, these guys are immortal. They have the ability to raise the dead, and the dead that they raise are basically foot soldiers called wights, or waits, depending on how you want to say it. They're undead. They're not particularly bright, but they don't seem to be totally dumb like a zombie, although closer to zombie than to vampire, and they definitely form a horde. So what ends up happening is as humans end up dying in the north, they end up being brought back to dead, brought back to life as dead and joining this undead army of wights or waits. In terms of the battle tactics of the White Walkers, really it's pretty simple. Kill stuff, turn it into waits, and grow an unstoppable army. So they're really bent on destruction and taking over. Okay, now that we have our primer out of the way, I wanted to talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from Game of Thrones and apply them to the real world. The first one is breaches are coming. Some of them actually are already here. If you've been following the news, you know that HBO actually had a breach. In that breach, there were things like several scripts were leaked or stolen. The hackers were demanding Bitcoin for ransom. During this whole thing, emails were leaked. An entire episode of Game of Thrones came out early. It was pretty much a mess. But I don't want the focus of this particular presentation to be on the real world and HBO. Instead, I want to be more generally applicable. So to that end, let's talk about security breaches at large. So these mega breaches, first off, they're becoming very commonplace. Just this year, millions and millions of records have been exposed. One that just happened last week was the Equifax breach, which dumped out 143 million records. Now, the ultimate ramifications of this leak are still to be seen, but it's a huge, huge leak, and it affects a great number of people. Another one that was kind of a mega breach or leak was voter registration records. So 191 million records were leaked earlier this year. That's virtually the entire American voting population. So if you vote, you're probably in that boat. Additionally, another mega breach this year was Zomato. That was 17 million records, and Zomato is a site that helps with food and restaurant guidance. Over on the right, we can see a chart, and this chart actually has several of the world's biggest data breaches. What I've done is just added dates to the side that you can read. If you start at the bottom, in 2004, what we're looking at, that bubble there, is AOL. And that was one of the first mega breaches where lots and millions of records were leaked or breached. Over time, what you can see is each of those bubbles, first off, the bubbles, it's just one bubble per breach, and the size of them is indicative of how many records or how many usernames were lost with the breach. So in essence, what you can very clearly see is that over time, there have been more and more and bigger breaches, to the point where now, I mean, you can't even see through the graph. They happen all the time. Another source of information on this is the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. This is kind of the gold standard in data breach stats. And what I did was I wanted to get an understanding of, based on the Verizon view of the world, I basically went to each of the reports from 2011 through 2017, and I found out how many breaches there were and plotted them all into a graph. And then I discovered that not only has it grown from 759 breaches in 2011 to just over 1,900 by 2017, they've actually been growing fairly steadily at a rate of around 22% year over year for the last 7 years. So now that I know, or now that I knew what the real world looked like in terms of breaches and what the threat looked like there, I thought to myself, well, it would be interesting if we could find a way to compare this with Game of Thrones, because as you guys know, there's also a threat that's growing there, this undead White Walker army. It's been multiplying in the north. So, when I was thinking to myself, well, how can I find a way to quantify this? What I came up with was finding the major events from each of the seasons, from season 1 through season 7, and then trying to find a scene from that season that could give me a hint as to the growth of White Walkers. And so what we see is in season 1, it's the first season where we see the White Walkers, and it's actually in the very first episode. And what we see is there was this attack in the woods. We don't see a whole lot in terms of White Walkers, but we do see enough bodies to know that they were there. In season 2, there's an encounter at Craster's house where we see a couple of more White Walkers. Still not really a clue as to the size of the army. By season 3, we see Sam actually kills a White Walker, and we see our first glimpse of the entire army. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is that although there are lots of them, there's space between them. So it's not super dense yet, but it's definitely growing. In season 4, there's a scene where Craster's baby is turned into a White Walker. So in the very front, you've got the baby, you've got the Night King, who's actually going to turn it into a White Walker. This is our first glimpse into how White Walkers are created. But then in the back, what you see is a whole row of these White Walkers. Now, keeping in mind that each White Walker is actually in charge of its own little battalion, you can kind of get an idea of how many different, battalions or groups of White Walkers exist, right? Now, season 5 is where we get this famous Hardhome massacre. Hardhome is a wildling city that was in the north, and it ends up being ambushed and overrun by the White Walker army. And this is, just a glimpse at the army. It's a total massacre, right? So there are thousands and thousands of Whites that come in and just wipe everybody out. So you can see really a lot of zombies here. Now, keeping in mind that when a human dies, it joins that army. By season 6, the density of this army is becoming, quite impressive. So in season 6, we've got the famous Hodor episode, and the White Walkers attack Bran at the Heart Tree. So again, very dense population of zombies. And by season 7, things are getting totally out of control. The White Walker army is huge. It has at least 3 zombies and a zombie-ized dragon, right? So definitely growing very rapidly. So from there, I thought to myself, well, let's see if we can compare the data sets. And conveniently, season 1 through 7 line up perfectly with 2011 through 2017. And so what we get is this, right? We've got our average growth rate of 22% for breaches, and we have a somewhat similar growth rate. So, you can see this big jump here for the Hardhome massacre, the similar growth rate for the zombies, right? Maybe not to the scale, but definitely a similar growth rate. Now, I guess my point here is that regardless if you agree with, my merging of totally scientific data with absolutely and wildly subjective data, there is a trend. And the trend has been over the last 7 years that both data breaches and White Walker army size has been growing rapidly. So it's going to be up to us to do something about that. And we'll talk about what options we have a little later in the presentation. The second lesson that I wanted to talk about was about insider threats. And I'm going to talk about insider threats both from a compromised insider point of view and a malicious insider view. So first we'll talk about the compromised insider. And my point is that compromised insiders make very powerful adversaries. To illustrate that point, let's talk a little bit about the problem with compromised insiders. So let's say for a second that you're the commander of the guard at some castle in Westeros, right? They're everywhere. You could be Jaime Lannister. You could be, working for the local lord of a castle or fort out in the middle of nowhere. Either way, you probably have a setup that's somewhat similar to what we've got going on here. You've got a castle or a fort or an outpost. You have some form of walls surrounding it to keep the bad guys out. If you're lucky enough, you've probably got a moat on the outside of that wall. And then you end up with something like a drawbridge, which makes it even harder to get through the front gate. And you've got guards. And, the goal here is just to funnel everyone into one, kind of entrance and exit point, and use your guards to determine if people should come in and out, right? Interestingly enough, if you are the director of IT security at some, startup or Fortune 500 company, you probably have a very similar setup, right? Your job here, instead of protecting the castle, is to protect your corporate network and the data and the employees that are using it. But you have similar tools, or at least they serve similar functions. You've got your network firewalls and your web application firewalls that are serving to keep people out, right? And that leaves kind of a gap that people could come in. And, you're basically using authentication, passwords, and access control to make sure that people have, the only people that can come through here are people who have the privileges and you've deemed to be worthy of doing so. Now, the problem comes here. If you are in the Game of Thrones world, it could be your stable boy, it could be the blacksmith, whatever. For corporate America, it could be your HR coordinator. And the problem in either case is that this threat is already inside all of this fortification, right? It's past your walls, it's past your firewalls, it's past your moat and drawbridge and guards, it's past authentication. These are people that you've already deemed to be trustworthy. They have credentials. And if they're not already on the inside, they can just use their legitimate access privileges to walk right in the door, to authenticate right into the database, because you've already given them those privileges. So to dig a little deeper into this analogy, I thought that a good place to start the conversation would be with the faceless men. Okay, so the comparison we're going to make here is faceless men versus modern malware. On the faceless men side, what they are is it's basically an assassin's guild, and they have the ability to steal the faces and the identities of their victims. And they use this face stealing or identity stealing ability to go undetected so they can move through forts and castles and towns unbeknownst to their victims until they find their ultimate target, and then they dispatch them. On the malware side, actually, there's some similarities here. So instead of Assassin's Guild, we've got this malicious software, and this software is typically programmed to take control of something. And that could be, a machine, a credential, an account. And then once it has control of that thing, it's going to use it to do the bidding of the attacker, which is usually a hacker. They also have the ability to use these identities or these credentials to move laterally around in the network. So for example, they can go into a network with one set of credentials and then use that access to kind of poke around and see what other goodies they can find or what servers they can compromise, and then move to the next to that next target and use that to jump off to another target and slowly move through a network. The problem here in both cases, whether you're in Game of Thrones land or whether you're in cybersecurity world, is that traditional security measures just simply don't stand a chance. The reason is that compromised insiders, they have a legitimate identity, right? Your stable guy, your stable boy is always in the castle. Your blacksmith is a known entity. Your HR person has legitimate credentials. They use known devices, and they have valid access privileges that your IT or security teams already provided them. Which means as they go about accessing and touching different things throughout your network, they're not sounding alarms. Everything looks and feels normal to various point products, right? This problem is compounded by the lateral movement that I just described. So let's look at a case study here. The case study that I thought was most appropriate for talking about compromised insiders is that of Arya Stark. Now, for those of you who don't know, Arya is a daughter from one of the famous houses of Westeros, that being the Stark house. Somewhere around season 5, she ends up going over to Braavos. She travels to the House of Black and White, which is the head of the Assassin's Guild, the Faceless Men. And then she trains with the Faceless Men, and she gains, not only the ability to fight, but also the ability to steal the faces of their victims and to use this identity stealing skill to her own ends. So what does she do with that? She goes totally savage. And I thought that was a perfect explanation for lateral movement. So what we're going to do is, to explain lateral movement, we're going to be following Arya Stark, who's our professional assassin at this point, and comparing her with Barbara Salazar, who is our HR coordinator. So on the Arya side, her basic timeline unfolds like this. So Arya has a couple of stolen faces, probably from the Hall of Faces, and she uses them to gain entry into the Twins. Now these faces, that's basically her first time using someone else's identity. So she gets into the Twins, which is the home of the Frey house. From there, she uses this identity to murder 3 Freys, including 2 of the Frey sons, Lothar Frey and Black Walder. These are Walder Frey, the head of the Frey household's sons. Okay, on the Barbara side, in essence, now whether this happened because she clicked on something that she shouldn't have, she fell victim to a phishing email, she downloaded something she shouldn't have, who knows. Barbara is infected with malware, and that malware steals her credentials. So from the hacker's point of view, the hacker now has the first identity, it being Barbara's. And the hacker uses Barbara's identity to investigate the network, looking for valuable assets. and then ends up discovering a payroll database, okay? Now let's advance both of those storylines. On the Arya side, we know that she used some stolen faces. She killed the sons of the House of Frey. Then she bakes them into a pie because she's a total savage. With that pie, she then feeds to her father, the house of the head of the Frey house, Walder Frey, and slits his throat. From there, she steals Walder Frey's face. This is the second identity in this timeline, if you will. Barbara, on the other hand, so we know that the hacker stole Barbara's credentials, used them to poke around in the network, finds a payroll database, and then the hacker remotely logs into this database using the default credentials for the server. So quick side note here, shame on whoever set up this database. They really should have changed the default username and password. This is what happens if you don't do that. So the hacker now has a second identity, right, which is the database administrator credentials of this database. So hacker's logged in, and then he makes uses these admin credentials to create a copy of the database, okay? Now let's talk about endgame. So Arya, she now is using Walder Frey's identity. She calls a feast, brings the entire Frey household, the entire clan, if you will, into this feast, and then she just poisons everybody, right? And this, in this way, she gets her revenge for the Red Wedding in which these Freys, the same group of people, killed her mother and brother. So pretty powerful example there. Now on the hacker side, so recapping real quick, hacker stole Barbara's credentials, used it to move through the network, logged into a database, backed it up, and then the hacker's going to return to Barbara's machine and use that machine to send the information off the network. The hacker already has the goods it came to get, and now it just has to send them off to its own server somewhere. So I thought this was a pretty good example of both a compromised insider and a compromised insider that uses lateral movement, which is a subject that many people struggle with. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the other type of insider threats, malicious insiders. Now, a malicious insider is basically a rogue employee. And, you know, when I was looking for examples of rogue, rogue people or betrayals in Game of Thrones, I found that there were way more of them than I thought there were. You know, when I was doing my research, first I came across this diagram and I was like, oh, you know, this will be totally simple. I'll just explain this diagram. As it turns out, I couldn't make heads or tails of it, but what I did find was that not even counting the most recent season of Game of Thrones, there were more than 77 betrayals up to season 6. And that includes anything that Cersei's ever done, anything that Littlefinger's ever done, and of course the infamous Red Wedding. The real world is much like Game of Thrones. There are absolutely malicious insiders, including Edward Snowden, who you guys probably have heard of, who was, stole a bunch of data from the NSA and spilled it out to the public and is now a famous whistleblower / a famous malicious insider, depending on, how you view the situation. From there, I wanted to figure out, okay, well, what does a malicious insider look like for the average organization? And for that, I turned to the Verizon data breach investigation report again. Now, what they did was they had looked at 277 instances of insider and privilege misuse, which is this malicious insider. And what they found is that overwhelmingly, it's just your internal employees. Sometimes it's collusion between employees. Occasionally, it's collusion with an external party. And sometimes it's actually a partner that's doing it. And who are these people? They're your departed employees. So it's your sales guy who wants to take his client list with him, right? It's your terminated employees. For example, maybe, you let go of a couple of developers and, they wait a couple of days after they've been fired and then they log into your GitHub because you didn't turn off their GitHub accounts and they start downloading source code, right? That was the best code I ever wrote. I'm taking it with me. Or it could be somebody like a disgruntled employee, right? Someone who failed their last performance review and is just upset. Now, what are they doing? So first off, one specific incident can have multiple things that happen in it. So these percents add up to more than 100. But by and large, the first thing that they're doing is just accessing personal information or healthcare information. Again, all of these stats are from the Verizon data breach investigation report. Now here, it could just be simply snooping. They don't necessarily need to be taking it with them. The next most common thing was downloading, so unsanctioned downloading of data. There's not necessarily a plan. They're not going to do anything with the data, but saving it for a rainy day. Like maybe I downloaded this thing in case I get fired, or you know what, this was a really great template or a really great presentation. Just in case I ever need it again, I'm going to keep a copy of it. The third most common thing that people were doing was theft of trade secrets. So this is sales numbers, sales projections, your leads, marketing plans, intellectual property, source code, you name it. This is legitimate theft. After that, it's just curiosity. So snooping around into data that you maybe shouldn't have, like, I don't know, maybe the salary data of your fellow coworkers, things like that. And then finally is straight up espionage. Now, the last question that I thought would be interesting to answer, and was also in this report, is how long does it take until a specific incident has been discovered, these malicious insiders? And what I found is of the 77 that the report had done research on, 33 of the 77 took months to discover, and 30 of them, which is roughly 39%, take years. So these malicious insiders have access to these systems for a very, very long time. And one of the reasons is that they're very difficult to catch. And the reason is that just like their compromised counterparts, malicious insiders have passwords that work, right? They have keys to the safe. They're already in your stronghold. They have legitimate access privileges. They're already inside of your gate or inside of your castle. And if they weren't, these are known entities that you've already entrusted with access. They could walk right in the gate. They can walk right past the guards. What's different between malicious insiders and compromised insiders is that their motives are not aligned with yours. These are people who have gone rogue. And then finally, one other quick point is that these malicious insiders actually become more powerful as you entrust them with more power, more resources, and more privileges. Said another way, if they're in control of your army or they have access to your GitHub, they can do more damage than if they don't. So what do you do about it? Both in the case of compromised insiders or malicious insiders, one easy way to detect the threat is to understand how the machines or the humans in your environment typically behave. So once you understand what normal behavior is, it's fairly trivial to find risky and anomalous behavior that deviates from that norm and might be indicative of threat or malice. Now, there are some technologies in the cybersecurity arena that do behavioral analysis, and they typically use machine learning, statistical analysis, and behavioral modeling to do that. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we wanted to track the VPN access for Barbara. Now, we could track various attributes of her VPN usage. It could be things like the time that she starts, the time that she stops, the duration, the IP addresses that she uses, or maybe even the country that she comes from. And so what we would do is every time that Barbara connects to the VPN from a specific country, like the US, we record a data point. And over time, we gather more and more data points. So she connects from the US, Germany, China, whatever. Over time, we get enough data to create a histogram similar to the one on the right, conceptually anyway. And looking at this, we can very quickly see, all right, well, it's normal for Barbara to log in from the US, from Canada, from Germany. Now, maybe just below her normal threshold is the Ukraine, right? But anything that happens less often than the Ukraine would be totally anomalous for her, like if she logs in from China or Brazil or Russia, for example. And so what you can do is by monitoring all attributes of all users in an environment, as these abnormalities start to happen, if enough of them happen within a specific duration or period, you can say, hey, something weird is going on here. So going back to our analogy, it could be that your HR coordinator that VPNs in from the Ukraine at night is Barbara, or it could be a hacker. It could be that your stable boy visiting the armory at night is, maybe that he needs to pry off a horseshoe and he just needs a dagger, right? Or maybe it's Arya plotting her next move. Okay. So lesson 4 I thought would be interesting is that walls are not enough. Now, what I mean by that is, first off, there's not a whole lot of difference between the walls that are used in Game of Thrones, being an ice wall, and the walls that are used in cybersecurity, that being a firewall. But I thought to myself, In either case, walls are probably not sufficient for defending your kingdom or your network. So how can you secure your kingdom or network? Well, you can typically take a couple of key approaches. You could take a predictive approach, trying to figure out where attacks will happen. You can try to prevent attacks. You can try to detect attacks, or you can respond to attacks. So let's look at what those would look like for Game of Thrones and cybersecurity. So for prediction, for Game of Thrones, you can use your experience in battle or your experience with a specific adversary like Cersei and try to use that information to predict how they might attack you or how you might be vulnerable in the future. You could utilize a spy network to gather info. So Varys is very famous for doing this. On the cybersecurity side, it's also quite similar, right? You can leverage your experience with past events and past attacks. You can do primary security research. You can go to sites like dark reading and benefit from the security research that other researchers have done. You can use all of this information to predict the potential attack vectors that your organization may have. And you can also do something similar to a spy network, right? You can leverage the security intelligence feeds that are available to you. So finding malicious IP addresses or finding malicious known domains. And when you see those indicators of compromise popping up at your network, you know that that might be the sign of an attack, right? On the prevention side, for Game of Thrones, we've talked about a bit of this already. We've talked about preventing attacks by fortifying, your castle's defense mechanisms, whether that be walls or gates or moats. In the cybersecurity world, we made this analogy already. It's very similar, right? Implementing firewalls and web application firewalls, authentication and access controls, things that keep the bad guys out and let the good guys in. For detection, in Game of Thrones land, it comes down to things like putting guards and sentries and scouts in the right places to discover threats and then to sound alarms so that you're not caught off guard. On the cybersecurity side, that comes down to implementing detection via point products. So things like, an endpoint product or a firewall or a proxy or, IPS. You can also do things like take all of those point products and dump them into either a SIM for correlation rules or into the user and entity behavior analytics tool. And in both scenarios, what's going to happen is you're going to get an alert when something's been detected that's abnormal or out of place. Finally, for response, in Game of Thrones, it means having troops or guards, right? Somebody that can help you to respond to these threats. In cybersecurity, it comes down to having security analysts or incident responders that are available to help you respond to threats. Super similar. So I thought to myself, the next interesting thing would be to compare security spend from the team of, Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow with that of maybe a modern CISO. And to do that, I used this chart that's the 4 security approaches. So prevent, detect, respond, and predict. It's probably from one of the analyst firms. And what I did was I tried to align the different types of tools that are available to each team to this same chart. So for the Daenerys Jon team, we've got the wall. That's clearly a prevention technique. On detection, we've got our wildlings and we've got our Night's Watch. They're both actually at the wall, so they can look for threats as they're approaching. They also function as a response technology. They have the ability to fight. On the response side, we've got dragons. We've got a navy. We have the Unsullied, which is essentially an infantry. We've got the Dothraki, which is essentially a cavalry. And then finally, they actually have some prediction technology. So Bran has the ability to see the past, in the present, and potentially even the future. So I would put him in the prediction category. If we look at the CISO approach, first off, I needed to figure out, so what are people spending money on? And for that, I found a report by SANS, the IT Security Spending Survey. It's about a year old, but what it does is it ranked different technologies, how security organizations are spending their money on different technologies. So you can see the top ones are access and authentication, things like IPS or other types of advanced malware prevention, endpoint security, wireless security, DLP, so on and so forth. So what I did was I overlaid these technologies across these 4 quadrants. And then I highlighted the top 4 items from this And what you can see is overwhelmingly that there's, today's CISOs are spending a lot of money on prevention and detection. So if we overlay those two, what we see is that, so the CISO, again, pretty heavy in prevention and detection, pretty light on response and prediction. Daenerys, she's light on prevention and prediction, but she is strong in detection and especially strong in response. Now, I thought to myself, this gap right here for response is very interesting because the modern CISO has this ability to find threats, theoretically, but there's a well-known security shortage and they have very little invested in response technologies, which means they probably have a bottleneck here and are unable to even respond to all of the different threats that they find. I believe that's definitely the case. So that brings us to lesson 5. How do you fight a battle when you're outnumbered? So first off, will we be outnumbered? On the Game of Thrones side, the answer is absolutely. The Game of Thrones team is going to be outnumbered. The reason is they're facing this adversary that gains steam whenever their numbers die. So as humans get killed, they end up switching sides and becoming, away and joining the White Walker army and fighting back against the humans. So if they're not already outnumbered, they will be outnumbered in the near future. On the security side, they're actually already outnumbered. So today's security team is definitely hurting from a talent point of view. So some stats for you. The first one is from a McAfee report. It says by 2019, 1 in 2 security openings will be vacant. The other one that I used in my report is from CyberEdge Defense Report. It's an annual report. And what they found is they interviewed 1,100 security professionals, and of those 1,100, 9 out of 10 respondents indicated a shortage of IT talent, IT security talent already at their organization. So this is a well-established problem. So I asked myself, well, what tools are available for each of these groups to kind of dig out of this situation? And what I came up with is something that's probably similar to what you've heard a lot in the security world. It comes down to people, processes, and tools, or people, tactics, and tools. On the Game of Thrones side, I think there's really 2 keys on the people area. So leverage the diversity of their army. They've got a cavalry, an infantry, an air force, and a navy. But they also have a team of leaders and a team of individuals who have very unique talents. Daenerys has the ability to control dragons. There are members of the team that have, various magic powers that are bestowed upon them by the Lord of the Light. You've got knowledge from the maesters, and the trick is going to be taking this group of people and these talents and implementing smarter tactics. They're going to need to trick and trap the undead, and ideally they're going to need to leverage that hierarchy or the multiplier effect by killing people who are higher, killing White Walkers that are higher up the chain of command. If you kill a White Walker, all of the weights under it die. So theoretically, they should be, targeting as high up the chain as they possibly can. Additionally, they need to be using better tools. So we know from the series so far that White Walkers and weights are vulnerable to fire, which means they're probably also vulnerable to wildfire, being kind of a higher version of fire. They can be damaged by dragon glass, and they can be damaged by Valerian steel. So they'll need to find and implement that. And then finally, we know that they're also vulnerable to dragon fire. So that's something they'll need to leverage along as they go. The cybersecurity version of this is actually not very different. So again, it comes down to leveraging your people, smarter tactics, and better tools. On the people side, there is already this well-established shortage of, security talent. So the trick for people is going to be finding ways to amplify your team's productivity. So shifting the use of your people away from time-consuming, tedious manual tasks and towards using their individual talents, things like, their experience, their ability to code or whatever it may be, just away from menial tasks and towards intelligence tasks. To do that, I've got a couple of tactics which I think will help. First off, and we'll talk about each of these more, outsource to machines where you can, holistically analyze your data together so you get the most out of your existing tools, orchestrate your systems so you have a single point of glass, and then look for ways to automate response. Additionally, in terms of tools, to support that, you need to look for tools and technologies that use machine learning and data science. that use the computational gains available of that to do things like behavioral analytics and to perform orchestration and automation. So let's talk about those. On the analysis side, holistic analysis really allows companies to get more out of their existing investment. So kind of the state of affairs as things are right now is that most organizations have all of these point products. You've got antivirus and endpoint and anti-malware and VPNs and database access monitoring, you name it. But they're all just looking at pieces of an attack. And today's attacks are very complex, and they often involve lateral movement across multiple of these silos. So just the example that I gave earlier, we had Barbara. She did a VPN login, which would have been in Juniper, if that was the technology in place. She did a bunch of remote accesses, which would be in Windows logs, keeping in mind that a lot of this stuff is common. In Imperva, you'd have remote login and database backup. This is something that's super common. Database administrators do this all the time. And in Cisco, you'd have a large outbound traffic alert. But this also happens all the time. This specific file, the recording that you're listening to right now, would count as large outbound traffic, and I do this all the time. So just me as one member of an organization would be, creating false positives all day long, right? So if you look at the view from any of these specific tools, it could all be normal, right? By holistically analyzing things, things become not normal. And what I mean by that is if you take all those logs from all those tools and you suck them into something like a user behavior analytics tool, what you can do is apply behavior context first. So you can compare the behavior of a user to themselves. You can compare it to their peer groups. You can take into account their employment status, their roles, etc. And then baseline behavior. What's normal for this group? What's normal for this user? What's normal for this organization? By viewing all of this information together, you can track lateral movement, and then you get the output is not, hey, I found an outbound a large outbound amount of traffic. It's about anomalous and risky activity, right? So outbound traffic might be an unusual amount of traffic for a specific user. For VPNs, it could be that lots of people VPN in from the Ukraine, but this one is abnormal for Barbara, right? This is the first time that Barbara has ever accessed this many systems in this short of a time. Or Barbara has never done any database activity. She's never logged into a database ever before. So this is super anomalous for her. By using kind of a UBA product and holistically analyzing data, you can get this level of granularity. Now, if you're already able to track lateral movement and to get this level of granularity, that brings me to my next point, which is really this. So it's 2017. We are right on the cusp of handing over the control of very large, very heavy, very powerful pieces of machinery to machines, that being self-driving cars. We have no problem leveraging, artificial intelligence and machine learning to tell us, where we might want to eat lunch or what hotel we should stay at. But we're still living in a world where cyber threats are being investigated in an incredibly manual fashion that involves collecting data from many systems and organizing it together into a timeline that could take weeks. If you think about it, so if I get this alert from a specific system, I don't know, like a malware alert, I have to determine, all right, well, what were all of the other systems that might have been involved? And then I need to go to my SIM, I need to query for them and pull them all, piece them all together. If I find that a specific asset or host name was involved, I need to figure out, well, whose asset was this? And if I find an IP was involved, I need to figure out, well, what user was using that IP at that time? All of this takes an incredible amount of time just so that you can assemble it into a timeline. But if you have machines that are capable of already creating that timeline, something that looks like this, there's no reason that you shouldn't look for technologies that can automatically create this for you and save an awful lot of work for your security analysts and your incident responders. My next point is, so if you're able to, at this point, have found advanced threats, you need something that can help you to automate the response to those threats. And what I suggest here is orchestration and automation. For those of you that read Gartner research, this is what they call SOAR, S-O-A-R, Security Orchestration, Analytics, and Response, I think, or Analytics and Reporting is what they call the category. The idea behind it is that you have a tool And this tool is functioning as a middleware, and it's using APIs to connect and to coordinate between different IT and security infrastructure. So you've got this platform. It's talking to all the different things that you have, like your email servers, your firewalls, I don't know, your anti-malware solutions, and it allows you to run actions in those systems and to pull information in from those systems. From there, you take your security teams, your level 4 analyst, and you have them codify their response to common things into best practices. And these best practices are going to turn into a response playbook. So, if you think about it, they've probably responded to malware 1,000 times and they know exactly what to do. And there's a set series of steps that they're going to go through each time. And so what we would be using these tools for is to basically turn that into a playbook that can be run at the push of a button, and it would reach out to different systems. So if we were talking about phishing, for example, it might look like what you see on the right. So you're going to, at the push of a button, the system's going to reach out to an email server. It's going to obtain the emails. From those emails, it's going to pull out the attachments. And then it's going to stick them into a sandbox and detonate those attachments, looking for abnormal behavior, trying to identify any abnormal network connections. And if it finds any, it might take those network connections and stick them into something like Cisco Umbrella and geolocate the IP addresses, come back with a reputation of the IP addresses. And based on that information, it might say, well, this looks like phishing. So I'm going to quarantine this now newly confirmed phishing email. And the goal is that you can basically automate much of the processes so that you get a lot more productivity out of your existing staff. So that's my last point. Just one quick comment on Exabeam. So what Exabeam is we are the first next generation security intelligence platform. We have solutions that help our customers to collect unlimited amounts of data and to do so for a reasonable, cost-effective price. We have the most deployed user and entity behavior analysis tool in the world. Here, what you're doing is looking at how all of the people and all of the machines within an organization normally behave, looking for abnormalities, and in doing so, finding advanced threats. And then we have tools that help our customers to effectively and efficiently respond to threats using API-based orchestration and workflow automation based on response playbooks. That's it. I want to thank you guys for your time. If you have any suggestions on a good security analogy for a zombie-ized dragon, feel free to hit me up. If you have questions or comments, you can find me on Twitter. You can reach me at Orion@Exabeam. And I guess that booth is no longer relevant, but thank you very much for your time.